Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started. Apologies for the slow start there. Today, I'm extending my welcome to you from Frankston at the top end of Victoria's Mornington Peninsula, where I would like to acknowledge the lands of our traditional owners, the Boonwurrung people. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as all other First Peoples amongst us. And kia ora, ngā tātou to our colleagues from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and welcome to people from all background and cultures joining us today. One of the central insights about solving complex problems is the value of a diverse range of perspectives and backgrounds in the problem-solving process. Hi everyone, I'm Rod Glover, and with my colleague Beth Noveck, it's our pleasure to join you for the next iteration of the ANZSOLG Future Public Sector Leaders series. I'm a Professor of Policy and Impact at Monash Uni and work at the intersection of policy and politics, with a particular interest in large-scale innovation at the levels of systems and societies. And with two major Royal Commission reports being released yesterday and today, I'm sure we'll talk about that level a little bit more. I'm also, in a separate life, the Academic Director of the new McKinnon Institute for Political Leadership, which trains our politicians. I'm joined today from New York with my collaborator and friend, Professor Beth Noveck. Beth, as you'll know, is the Director of the Governance Lab at New York University. She's one of the world's leading lights on the new practices of governments around the world. And she was, of course, Head of Open Government and Deputy CTO in the Obama White House, and has since worked with policy and political leaders around the world on policy and governance. She has yet another book coming out soon, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and is also a practitioner during the time of COVID as the Chief Innovation Officer for the state of New Jersey, which we'll also talk about. Today, we're going to talk about our report of late 2019, where we termed the creeping crisis of effectiveness and legitimacy facing governments, a crisis that relates to our struggle to tackle the big systemic challenges of our time, what we would typically think of as public problems or wicked problems, the complex, the uncertain, the contested challenges. Our 2019 report was a critical one, but also a hopeful one that illustrated how a range of new approaches are being used in government, often in a sophisticated and expert way, to help solve these complex public problems. However, we also acknowledge that story is a really patchy one, as we'll explore, and there are things we can do about that. The format for today, we're going to spend about the first half of this session talking and hopefully provoking some questions from you. We'll start with some of Beth's first-hand experiences on the front lines of the COVID battle in the US. We'll then ask what we might take from that experience as we look forward. We'll revisit the report and the range of tools we talk about as helping us to solve public problems, and what we found in our survey of over 500 public servants in late 2019. And then we'll outline how this challenge has evolved with COVID, where we think that agenda goes next, and some plans we have in store with ANZSOLG for 2021. We hope to leave a significant amount of time over for Q&A. A reminder that this is the Zoom webinar format, so there is no chat function. However, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so please make use of that. In the interest of getting to as many questions as possible, we would ask to try and make your questions as short and sharp as you can. Just to kick off, a quick recap of our report. Our report for ANZSOLG was called Today's Problems, Yesterday's Toolkit. It had argued the need to modernise the toolkit that we use to help solve complex public problems. The context was obviously the buffeting that governments of all political stripes are experiencing by technological and societal change, and interestingly, since the report, by COVID itself. Before COVID, and still, there's a pervasive sense globally that governments are not doing as well as they ought to solve our biggest public problems. Exposure of this failure to meet our most pressing challenges helps to explain why in Australia and elsewhere, trust in government has reached an all-time low prior to COVID. But with new technologies and now new circumstances comes the opportunity to rethink how our public sector workforce might develop a new set of skills and capabilities, particularly in how we use data and how we actively reach out to solve problems beyond the public sector itself. We'll go into the findings of our survey, which essentially confirm that our public servants are actually really eager to embrace new approaches to innovation, but that there are limits in how they're trained for it and their capacity to exercise it. And there are constraints imposed by some of our policy systems and quite blunt management tools such as hiring freezes, efficiency dividends, and funding cuts for experimental initiatives. The slow adoption of new tools widely used beyond government, as well as some of the cultural challenges we face within bureaucracy, was seen as eroding the prospect of more collaborative, creative, and empathetic public sector workers. To reverse this trend, the report argues that government needs to train up a generation of what we term public entrepreneurs who tackle problems using a range of data and evidence-driven and participatory methods to be more considered and comfortable with risk and even with initial failure in pursuit of outcomes that improve the lives of citizens. I won't go into the findings of the report because we will get into it very shortly. But one observation I did want to make was the emphasis that we have is on a mix of methods. We strongly advise against the headlong rush to see any single method as having all the answers. Whether it's system thinking or design thinking or data science or behavioural science, we think there's real value in looking wider in terms of the methods that we have a familiarity with. That lens will involve a degree of discomfort, a degree of understanding and living with ambiguity, and an underlying empathy and humility within the public sector. We also argue that we need to be really cognizant of the limits of our capabilities and of the practical, organisational and political constraints we face. To ground the discussion of the report, which we will go into in a bit more detail, I'd like to first throw to Beth to get some reflections from her as someone who's been on the policy front line through COVID in her public sector role. Over to you, Beth.
Great, thanks Rod, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So I'm just really delighted to be here, and it really has been, in a way, a privilege to go from, in many ways, the survey-based research, theoretical work in many sense that we did of talking about government skills and public sector skills to really getting to use and practice many of those skills over the last year. And I think what I'm going to say now is going to resonate with everybody because it's surely not unique to my experience. So I have the great privilege to lead a team of technologists, designers, and policy professionals in our office that we call the Office of Innovation in the state of New Jersey. We're one of the few innovation shops among the states here in the States. And when COVID hit, we really felt the need, as we all did, to act in an agile way and to act fast to really try to deliver better services to citizens. So that first better service we needed to deliver was just better information to people. People were hungry for answers and questions. There was as you'll recall, we still exist in a state of disinformation and misinformation. And so we wanted to create a single website where people could find the information that they needed about COVID-19. And so what we did was we turned around and we partnered immediately with a private sector company that helped us to stand up a website in 3 days. We partnered across all the agencies in the state to be able to gather the information that people needed, whether it was about school closings or how to manage your business and keep your workers safe, and to gather all of that information. We partnered with the state's universities to create a team of 75 student workers who helped us to edit legalese into plain English in order to ensure that that information would be accessible. We partnered with an NGO called the Federation of American Scientists, a highly regarded 75-year-old nonprofit here in the United States, who in turn crowdsourced a network of 600 scientists to be able then to answer people's questions about COVID. So if they had a question about opening of schools or businesses, we provided it from the state. If you had a question about science, should you drink bleach or wash your counters with bleach, or drink vodka or wash your counters with vodka, the network of scientists would provide answers to that question. And I'm pleased to report that over the course of the pandemic, that site has been visited over 70 million times since it was launched. We get over a million, about 1.2, 1.3 million people visiting the site every single week. And that's in a state of fewer than 9 million people. And that's just one of many such stories. When the pandemic launched and so many people lost their jobs, we went from 3% unemployment to almost 20% unemployment. So in 3 days, we launched a jobs portal, the first one in the nation, and we put up 50,000 jobs in essential businesses. We didn't have data to be able to know and predict the spread of the pandemic. So in 1 day, we talked to Kerala, India, found out what they had done, talked to a number of other jurisdictions, and then we quickly stood up a symptom tracker, partnering again with universities to be able to analyze the data and predict the spread of the virus. So all of that to say, I think what we really learned firsthand was how to practice what we preached in terms of what we've been talking about with regard to using new skills. Above all, as Rod already alluded to, the skills of data, which so many of us have seen to be instrumental, both as people working in government and customers of government, the greater uses of data during the COVID pandemic, but also, and I think above all, the greater ability to use collaboration and participation with the private sector, with universities, with citizens, to really solve problems in new ways, to allow us to respond more effectively and more agilely, as well as ultimately more legitimately, because we're working with citizens to solve problems. Rod, I'm going to pass it back to you. I think you're mute, though. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Sorry, I was on mute. How many times have I done that? Thank you, Beth. So there's clearly a lot that we have learned and are still learning from the pressure of the COVID experience that has prompted us to behave within the public sector in ways that we might have, in many cases, struggled to before COVID or outside the COVID context. Just to build on Beth's reflections, Behaviour Works within my institute at Monash has worked throughout COVID to continuously survey Victorians on their attitudes and responses to a wide range of policy measures, from social distancing to mask wearing to lockdowns. And that near to real-time data has actually informed the policy decisions of the Victorian government and cabinet all the way through. Interestingly, that's something that we would not have got up with government outside of the urgency of the COVID context. So it is clear that we are capable of being more collaborative, that we can follow the expert advice in a different way and follow the data, and that we can adapt and learn more rapidly when we have to. But what of all of this are we going to take forward when we might not have the urgency or the attention that COVID has demanded? And it's worth thinking at this point about what the differences might be between the crisis moment and what might come next. Not that we're out of that crisis moment. The big defining difference, of course, is the urgency and attention that exists in a crisis. The absence of that attention for persistent, unmet policy problems is a large part of the challenge of those problems in themselves. The failure to get traction even when performance is persistently poor. The urgency of dealing with COVID can teach us things, but it's worth remembering that it's not exactly the same challenge as the inaction we face or the challenges we face in dealing with long-term structural challenges, such as a climate and energy transition or entrenched inequalities or systemic racial injustices. In a disruptive crisis like COVID, we have very short timeframes. Decisions have to be made based on imperfect and limited knowledge, and there is constant political pressure and media scrutiny. It's intense and the tempo is fast. It demands that senior public servants and senior politicians lead and spend the relational capital that they may have built up. If they were not in crisis, they would probably be considering more carefully how they spend that capital. For instance, they may be able to take an approach more akin to a real options approach, where they delay decisions until they have much better information on which to act. And of course, we know that they may also choose to simply kick issues down the road for those where the needs are too complex or maybe too controversial. A feature of the creeping crisis that we describe and that we would describe as characteristic of a number of public problems or wicked problems is actually that its failures can persist. The lack of attention and urgency around those issues can continue. The challenge can be left unmet, and there's not necessarily any self-correction to that process, which really begs the question of how might we sustain collaboration, innovation, experimentation when our issue is no longer in the spotlight. And in our report, we argue that we need to think afresh about our institutions to do that. But we also need to work within our existing institutional structures to think about how we might develop and spread much more widely the skill sets and mindsets of what we term the public entrepreneur. Those that are being used in the public sector, but in a patchwork way. One of the interesting findings of our report is that for all of the methods that we explore, somewhere in the public sector, that is being used in a deeply sophisticated and expert way, but it is a patchy story. we're not necessarily accessing that where we need it across the public sector. Beth, I might throw back to you at this point to just talk a little bit about the new methods that we talk about in the report.
Sure, and Rod, you've alluded to quite a number of them already, but let me try to be a little bit systematic in how we focused on them in the report, what we heard about from the 400 people that we interviewed, and we've replicated this study now in 3 countries, so we have data from about 1,300 different people who've responded, as well as looking at how governments around the world, some of the leading edge governments, are thinking differently about training and the skills that they're looking at when they're talking about next generation skills. So I think that, and let me, at the risk of gilding the lily, emphasize a point that you've already made, which is that, again, it's not any one of these skills, it's the combination of them. And therefore we should talk about how we can, as people in government who are frequently jack of all trades and master of none, how we can bring together all this different capacity. But I would say it starts no matter what with being able to define the problem. And being able to define a problem to go from issue, something quite large and inchoate, to a very specific problem defined with data, with benefit of human insight, so that we're really understanding the problem as people experience it on the ground. So we're seeing this now, countless times. I have to say, in the state of New Jersey, and this is not unique for us by no means, we're seeing countless failures with vaccine distribution. One of those failures stems from the fact that we're not understanding the challenges of the people who are using these websites where they go to sign up for a vaccine, where we're not understanding the experience from their perspective. So one of the things that, my team came in to do, for example, to help fix the crisis in vaccine distribution, was talk to senior citizens, talk to the elderly, talk to the homeless, talk to prisoners, understand the people we're trying to serve and how we need to serve them better. So that begins with, again, I think, an overarching emphasis on defining the problem that we're really trying to solve, and then really centers on 2 additional skills that we need, or 2 additional tools in the toolkit, which relate to our ability to define the problem. That is greater uses of data, or data analytical thinking, and human-centered design. So if we think about one as essentially looking large scale across a whole population at a problem, and the other, human-centered design, about talking to individuals and really trying to understand their individual perspective, the combination of the 2 really help us to get a better picture of the problem. But it's far too rare that I think in government we pause to define the problem adequately, as opposed to launching headlong into the solution that we think will work. So problem definition, data analytical thinking, human-centered design, I would say. Then the ability, though, not only to define a problem with data and with people, but to come up with solutions with help of data and with people. So here is what I might call it collective intelligence. Some people would call it open innovation. Some people refer to crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is just a method. It's just a way of using the collective intelligence and wisdom of people to be able to come up with solutions to problems. So whether those people are academics in universities or experts in industry, whether they're people in the communities we're trying to help, they very often have really good ideas about how to solve the problems as well as what the problems are. And we're seeing great examples around the world of governments turning to uses of collective intelligence to better solve problems together. But it is not intuitive to know how to do that. Any one of these things, whether it's problem definition or using collective intelligence, is really a learned set of skills. Finally, let me mention just a couple of other quick skills, and then Rod, I'd like to pass it back to you because I know there are a few other things that you bring to this conversation that we want to get on this list here. Another skill that I think we all need to develop is the skill of what we might call rapid evidence review, fast field scanning. Some people call it evidence synthesis. We need the ability to get smart quickly about what else is out there, what else has worked, and what else has failed. And to also understand if it's worked somewhere, why it's worked somewhere else. So it's a kind of research skill, but it's not the research skills we learned in school, where we have endless amounts of time to write a paper or write a dissertation. It's research in a government timeframe, particularly government when we're in a crisis. And I think the acute crises, whether it's COVID or whether it's power outages in Texas or wildfires in Australia, we have acute crises frequently, but even when we have chronic crises, We have to work in a political time frame. That means we keep cognizant of election cycles and the demands of politicians, which means we don't have endless amounts of time. So learning how to scan for what else is out there is incredibly important. Learning how to partner with others to be able to implement solutions to problems, to be able to deliver rapid and effective solutions to problems, and of course, to be able to conduct experiments and measure what works. So those are my lists. They cut across 4 stages: problem definition, solution identification, implementation, and then scaling. And at every stage, it's the tool of using some kind of data and some kind of collective intelligence to help us to really get faster and better and more effective at doing our job. So Rod, would you say I've hit everything, or are there a few other things that you might want to bring to that?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. Interestingly, when we did the survey work, we also did 14 in-depth interviews with senior policy leaders and innovators to get more of a qual perspective on where we were as a public sector in Australia, the States, and in New Zealand. And there were 2 gaps that they saw. The first was a really strong view that we're still under-exploiting the opportunity that our data sets provide us for better understanding the effectiveness of different policies, programs and interventions, but also understanding systems. And the second was sort of a broader concern that that as we've broken problems down into ever smaller components and structured our bureaucracies around those narrower and smaller components, we're finding it hard to reconnect the pieces to get a sense of the system as a whole. And this is a perspective that comes through the strategic commissioning work of Janino Flynn and Gary Sturgis at ANSOG, where they talk about so much of our focus on the short term, the tactical and the piecemeal in that problem definition phase, that we can easily lose sight of what we have to do differently in a system sense for the long term, the strategic, the holistic view. So I think systems is a really interesting lens that is not really part of the training we do in the public sector. And it also relates to one approach that we do mention in the report that's very relevant to today's conversation, which is mission-driven innovation, which is, if you like, a microcosm of that system level analysis. So yesterday's Aged Care Royal Commission, quite extraordinarily, had a split finding amongst its commissioners, one of whom, Tony Pagoni, argued that the only way we're going to front up to the tragic failures of our aged care system is actually to take it out of the hands of the ministers and the departments that have overseen it to date. And this is obviously a really controversial issue, and there's a question in the chat from Dan about, are our politicians ready to enable the public sector to innovate, to work differently, to embrace risks? Well, we have actually a lot of examples of where this has happened before. The classic example in the Australian case is the Australian Institute of Sport. It was set up with this mission-driven mandate, going from what was a spectacular failure in Australia's elite sporting performance to being probably the most successful performing nation in the world in the Olympics. But other sort of modern examples like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the National Disability Insurance Agency, the intent of the Medical Research Future Fund, but also specialised institutions like the Reserve Bank, the ABC, CSIRO. These are all independent institutions that don't operate with the same rules of the game as many of our policy bureaucracies. They're also really high-performing institutions, and interestingly, they're very highly trusted by the public, and they're still seen as public institutions. So I think we're going to have a conversation as we look at areas like climate, like inequality, like racial injustices, about how we might go after some of these harder issues that can get us over the urgency and attention that we lack in the acute crisis, in the creeping crisis or the chronic crisis that we have in the acute crisis. But we also in the report obviously emphasise that there's a different way to come at this, which is to build a broad base of bottom-up capabilities for public problem solving within our public sector, to build a generation and a cohort of people that are committed to solving public problems in new ways. And we also explored in that survey work what some of the new demands for how people would like to be trained or how people would like to learn might be. So Beth, I was wondering if you might just talk through a couple of those points that we learned from the survey about how maybe that development work might need to be done differently.
Yeah, so very briefly, what we were trying to do was to get at what people's skill level is with regard to some of these new uses of data and collective intelligence. It is very difficult to ask people to self-assess their own skills. First of all, even just the definition of what constitutes a skill is a hard thing, but secondly, people are notoriously unreliable at self-assessment. And so we asked people really two things. We asked them the extent to which they could explain, they understood a concept well enough that they felt they could explain it to others. And then we asked them how much they or their team actually used a given skill in practice, and whether they'd gotten any training in that skill. And so what we learned really across the board is that even where there was an awareness of, enough awareness of a skill to be able to explain it, and the best known skill in terms of what people said they did the most of was that a problem, so it said they could explain the best, was that a problem definition. Even there where that was the case, there still was only about, across the board, about half of people didn't really, sort of on average, across the skills that we asked about half of people didn't even have awareness enough of skills to be able to explain them. And then we asked people how much they used a given skill. What we were learning was that awareness does not actually translate into use. So it was frequently the case that where people said, even where they said they had awareness of a skill, the ability to explain it, it did not translate into their ability to actually use that skill in practice. Where, however, and this was really the dramatic thing, is where we asked people, however, about if they had gotten trained in a skill. And then when they actually had used a skill, they really used a skill very, very frequently. So for those people, for example, who used problem definition, they then used it all the time. When they used human-centered design, they then used it all the time. And perhaps less surprisingly, what we heard from people is that an overwhelming majority of people said that they really, really wanted to get more training in these kinds of innovation skills, and they weren't getting trained in them. So in short, where people used a skill, they used it all the time, but the great demand for training, but that demand wasn't always being fulfilled. We asked people a lot of questions, as Rod mentioned, about what kind of training they would like. In other words, shorter term, longer term, online, offline. I think some of the answers to those questions will change as a result of COVID, much more familiarity with doing things like being on Zoom all the time. But it was tremendously sort of diverse in terms of what people said they wanted with regard to the type of training. But when it came to the subject matter of the training, overwhelming interest in learning these skills and not enough usage of it. Do you want to fill in any specific numbers there, Rod, or I can go into some specific numbers from
No, I
contexts?
think that's okay. I think probably just the one other observation would be, we did also survey about the innovation environment, and it gets to the point that you've raised in the Q&A, Dan, about the sort of the willingness of sort of our masters in both politics and in the public service to give people the space to use different approaches. And unsurprisingly, a big determinant of the use of different approaches was the willingness of people to embrace those and allow those and facilitate and culturally support them. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about the extent to which we grow the use of different approaches that we can learn from internally within our public sector organisations. In a private sector context, we would talk about the innovator's dilemma, where you're sort of doing things very different to a dominant culture. And do you have the license and permission to do that inside an organisation? It's also in the literature referred to as something called the paradox of embedded agency, which is, again, that idea of how can you exercise agency within an organisational culture that doesn't really support it? And of course, there's no obvious inherent paradox in that we change our internal cultures and our internal organisation when we actually find proof points, when we build it bottom up, when we exercise our leadership and agencies in different ways. It does start to reshape the culture. I would encourage people to keep pumping us with questions. The Q&A function's there for you to throw anything at us. We can go very broad. But just before we dive into the Q&A, I just want to talk a little bit about what it might mean for where we go next. At the macro level, obviously, there's a debate right now about whether we just try and get back to normal, which is a quite natural desire, particularly how tired a lot of people are and how tired the public is, or whether we take the opportunity to reset for a different future. And I think there's a really interesting political leadership challenge coming to carry both of those groups together, to hold the spaces and create the spaces for longer term deliberation and dialogue for long enough for us to move forward, but to do it in a way that actually takes the community with us. And, you know, it's a really interesting question about where the next 6 or 12 months goes, I think. On the one level, there's no public appetite for that. And the idea that we're going to take the crisis and really seize the moment of the crisis and turn it into an opportunity is far from a given. Governments are going to face incredibly limited bandwidth, competing demands, obviously new budget pressures. So we're really going to have to bottom up within the public sector, work out what are all of our opportunities for solving more complex problems and for solving them faster, and for developing on the inside or the outside systems that are higher bandwidth, that draw on a wider range of methods and engage with a wider range of actors, so expanding our toolkit and our repertoire, but also systems that are high energy, that can learn really quickly and solve problems quickly, as we had in COVID, being really adaptive and agile in a way that maybe we're not used to. So that's going to be a challenge for both our existing institutions, but it also might require some new institutions as well. In terms of the questions, examples in Australia or the US, Eric has asked about where public organisations are doing this well. Beth, I might throw to you. I'm happy to jump in on the Australian end of that.
Sure. So in terms of where we're seeing this done well, I think there's two parts to what the this is. On the one hand, there's the question of where we're seeing innovative organizations and institutions that are using data and new technology in effective ways to be able to deliver better services, to be able to create more effective policies, to do so in a more responsive way. And that's where I would point to, you know, and this is not unique to the US, there's a network of what I would call innovation labs that have sprung up in government all around the world, including in Australia, all over Canada, in the US, both at the federal and at the state level. But I think what's important, again, coming back to what you said before, is to distinguish between innovation organizations and digital. So those that are purely digital, centered around tech, I think have their limitations, in the same way that we might say something like a Mind Lab in Denmark, which was really at the forefront of bringing human-centered design to government, as you may know, closed 2 years ago after 16 years in operation, largely because these things are one method shops. And I think what's exciting is, you know, what worked during COVID for us, and by no means, again, we're far from in the clear, and we have this incredible amount of work to do, but where we've had some successes, or where we're bringing together technology, policy, and design, where we're using both data and collective intelligence. And that's where these innovation offices, I think, are really doing a good job. And there are wonderful examples of them. Ontario in Canada has one, and the state of Colorado has one, and we're seeing great work being done out of Helsinki. And I'll put also a link in the chat in a second to a whole series of case studies about governments all around the world that I think have been really good at institutionalizing the use, especially of collective intelligence. I think there's far greater understanding of the need for data and using data, and I could give you many examples of that. But the question about how do I combine uses of data with human intelligence, so human in the loop, is the harder case, and I'll put some examples of that in the chat. So what's going on in Australia, Rod?
So in Australia, I think we're seeing a few things. I think one is there's a broad conversation around the emergence of a professions model in how we develop capabilities in the public sector, that's similar, borrowing a bit from the UK, where we're developing communities of practice and learning that are building on the labs that already exist in state and federal governments, in particular areas such as within design or within data analytics or within behavioural insights. But I think that's quickly getting into the space, as you mentioned, about the importance of what we term the bilinguals. So the data science into economic policy, the behavioural science into health policy, the the design thinking into our schooling system. So it's that combination, I think, of the methods into the deep policy systems. And I think that where we've not got to in Australia yet, and where you were hinting at with the innovation offices and units, Beth, is just a really strong view that we have around the importance in really complex problems of, I guess, bridging capital as opposed to bonding capital. So if you think of the bonding capital as strengthening the strong connections you have, that people that work like us and think like us, even if you work in different policy areas. So that, for instance, would be your design labs or your behavioural insights networks or data analytics centres and the like. But even more important than that, I think, is to develop a literacy around the full breadth of innovation capabilities, and that requires a bridging capital. It's a literacy you need that enables you to work with people who don't think like you and work with people that you don't normally work with. It's the harder work of interacting people, talking across boundaries and across languages and across cultures, in which we see sort of all public servants benefiting potentially from a greater breadth. Interestingly, I think a few years ago, we would have also had a gap that we would see in the implementation space. But I actually think in Australia and in the States in particular, we've seen a real emphasis on delivery and implementation over recent years. Maybe even so much so that our gap at the moment in some of those jurisdictions is not the delivery and implementation and practice end, but might actually be way back at the system design and directionality and sort of policy vision and direction space. So I do think there are plenty of examples in Australia where it's done well. The one that I really like is the Australian Taxation Office. They decided and determined to both rethink their mission in terms of a service rather than a compliance, and a partnering rather than a compliance culture. But where it's actually taken them is they need to understand the systems in which they're operating. So they're probably the best public organisation in Australia in terms of how they use systems thinking in developing their policy solutions. Just going to the questions, Michelle Wellington has asked about the politics involved in use of data, particularly data that's community sentiment data or market research that might be perceived in a particular way or might be politicised and might be subject to a particular type of media scrutiny as well. I actually think, I'll ask you about this in a moment, Beth, but I do think this is a real challenge for us. I think it is really important that we are actually asking the community how they're experiencing things, particularly in fast-moving environments like COVID. It informs better solutions on the part of government, but it is also, it is a dangerous territory because it can often be perceived as basically getting into the marketing space and the political spin space or the manipulation space. Beth, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just, so very briefly, I think one of the, some of this sentiment analysis data is fantastic in terms of our ability to get an early pulse on what people think. But the danger with these kinds of, let me call them passive approaches, or market research approaches, as opposed to what you're talking about, Rod, actually talking to people, giving them the chance to let their voice be heard, I think is obviously the dangers that both we fail to fully understand the problem as people experience it, number one. Two, we're only hearing from people who are vocal in certain channels, including social media. That means we're not hearing from non-dominant communities. We're not hearing from people who are not using these channels. We're not hearing precisely from the most vulnerable communities whom we most need to talk to. And that has very grave risks in terms of equity and fairness. But it also means we really miss out. I think there's a tendency both within data analysis to go for these easy approaches, but also in human-centered design, where we like to go out and interview a couple of people in the church basement, and we don't take the added steps necessary to ensure that we're hearing from all people who really need to be heard from. And that runs significant risks, again, in terms of equity, in terms of legitimacy, and in terms of inclusion and ultimately then our solutions end up failing because we haven't really adequately defined the problem if we have not included people in how we gather our data, whether it's in more quantitative ways or whether it's more qualitative ways. It all comes down to a form of data gathering. And if we take the easy way out, there are really risks to that, as we've seen time and time again. And especially, the failure, again, to include people who are from what here we would call non-dominant communities or vulnerable communities or minority communities is really a risk that we cannot afford.
Yeah, I totally concur with that. I think that it is really worth calling out the difference between the sort of quite immediate and often superficial market research and the idea of deep design, where you're really trying to get an understanding of the lived experience and what sits behind the lived experience of people affected. But also you're trying to understand where that fits in a systemic context. So you're actually doing the harder and the longer work that is slower, but actually sort of has to be part of that slow thinking that accompanies the fast thinking and the rapid learning. Beth, I'm interested in where the parallel of this conversation sits in the US at the moment. Obviously, still caught up much more so than we are here in the immediacy of the challenge, and whether the same conversations are taking place, particularly, I guess, with a new administration in the US.
So the conversation being the COVID, what are the lessons learned?
Not so much the lessons learned, but perhaps the need to do things differently within our public sector organisations. The willingness to embrace, to look outside, to engage deeply with those affected.
So in terms of this, how we think about doing things differently, look, we've had a number of challenges. COVID is only one of them. We've, of course, had 4 years of a presidential administration at the federal level where we have seen deep tensions between the political classes and the just the whole name, the deep state, which was a term frequently used during the Trump administration. We've seen instances of politicization of science, misuse of information being taken offline, public servants being bullied. Towards the end of the Trump administration, there was an executive order put in place to give the White House the ability to convert almost every civil servant into an at-will employee. I'm not sure if the news of that traveled there. It's a little bit of a wonky story. Even here, it was hard for people to make sense of because it was so in the weeds. But the ability to essentially eviscerate the tenure of civil servants and use them as political pawns. So we have had coming out of and again, we're still in the midst of COVID, but with hopefully this challenge soon to be in the rearview mirror, compounded with our added political challenges, deep political division, misinformation, et cetera, all the situations we're familiar with. I think there is a deep interest in, or at least I would advocate for, a commitment to focusing on how to work differently. And, when I was asked before about places that are doing it right, and I said, what do you mean by this? One of the other this that we didn't talk about was places that are thinking about training people differently, not just how they're working differently. So there are, I think, very forward-thinking governments like in Canada, where they are attempting to think about innovation skills training across the whole of the enterprise. There are places like Argentina, where they've instituted innovation skills training, combining now both data and human-centered, and are training 20,000 people and tying advancement and promotion to the taking of innovation skills courses. Germany has launched a new what they call the Digital Academy, but it's by no means limited to only tech skills or coding. It's very much focused on new ways, or will be focused on new ways of working. That's the hope, that's the direction they're going to go in, but they're focused on how do we rethink from a whole of government perspective, not just creating a data science office here, a human science there, an innovations thing here. But how do we think from a whole of enterprise perspective about ways of working differently? I think in the US, at least at the national level, we're at the beginning of this conversation. The new administration has been busy, including undoing the executive order that I just mentioned to you with regard to the civil service. There has not been a concerted focus yet, though, on training, on upskilling, on reskilling, and since so much has been focused on essentially undoing what's come before, including also further executive orders that related to equity and how race is handled within the public sector. So there's been some work done now on increasing diversity in hiring, but I think it's coming. And I know that from some conversations recently that philanthropy here is looking closely at how to support greater efforts towards diversity, towards introducing people with new kinds of skills into government and thinking about training. But last thing, I've gone on too long, but last thing I'll just mention is to tag onto your point about new kinds of institutions, new kinds of innovations. I think the opportunity now to think about using technology in new ways to create new sorts of institutions, new ways that existing institutions can become more accountable to the public through more networked, more open forms of working. Again, this part about how do we reach out outside our own boundaries in order to help remedy that problem of politicization and abuse of public sector that we saw so much of. I think there's real interest now in looking at how do we innovate our current institutions to try to de-risk much of what we saw happen in the last 4 years.
Yeah, just to build on that, there's a question from Karen about balancing innovation and the industrial relations limitations in the Australian system. I actually think this is a real role for our public sector leaders. So there is a demand and a desire for more learning by doing, for coaching and mentoring, for the training that people receive and the professional development that people receive as being recognised in our promotion systems and our recognition systems in the public sector. I think there's also a really strong case to think about increasing mobility in and out of the public sector to get a wider range of experiences, but also across the public sector in different departments. And I think this sort of future of the workforce and the role of the workforce is part of actually, the role of the workforce as part of the solution here, I think is a really important framing requirement for our public sector leaders. So I think one thing that we've got to really think about, given particularly where the US debate has been and where the Australian debate has threatened to be at certain times, is where within the public sector do we see that stewardship responsibility for the long term taken seriously? So when we think of systems change and really hard problems, the stewardship responsibility is shared by our political class and our parliament and our legislature, by our administrative structures of government and by our civic institutions. And I actually think it's really important that our public sector leaders through organisations like AMSOG and the public sector commissions take that stewardship responsibility really seriously and start to articulate a value proposition where we see the public sector workforce as part of as really active parts of solutions to public problem solving. You know, if the public sector is not itself and our public sector leaders are not prepared to stand up and articulate the value of the public sector, what we see is that it's really easy for those outside to paint it in a different light. So I think there's a really important stewardship responsibility here. Just one final quick question, Beth, that's been asked in the chat. Your thoughts on citizen juries or perhaps anything that really grabs you in that collective intelligence space? How do we tap into the insights of those outside of government?
Ooh, the world. So we are seeing a real explosion in terms of interest in new institutions for using collective intelligence. I think citizen juries is obviously not a new idea. They've been used successfully in Australia and in the United States for many, many years. I'm thinking, of course, of the South Australia experiments around nuclear power and other questions that have been dealt with using citizen juries, or what are sometimes called mini publics. So I think, we've seen places like the Irish Constitutional Assembly. You've seen the French using larger scale, again, citizen assemblies. It's basically citizen juries, but bigger, for dealing with climate issues. You've seen the use of them in British Columbia as well. So I think these are great, these kinds of institutions that use a representative sample of citizens. My most favorite one at the moment is what they're doing in the region of Belgium, where their parliamentary committees each include a representative sample of citizens. Looks like a citizen jury. It's about 45 citizens for each committee that serve on the committee together with parliamentarians. So I think it's a really exciting example. Again, what I like about it is that it's an institutionalized use of collective intelligence and citizen participation. But I'm equally excited about the models and examples that are not simply random samples or representative samples of citizens, but are also designed to reach out to citizens with different kinds of expertise. And this gets back to your Royal Commissions and ANZOG and the role of third parties in really helping to organize different forms of expertise. So at the GovLab, we do a lot of work on what we call smarter crowdsourcing. So for example, last week, in an effort to help a group of universities think about the future of the university, we got together 40 experts from around the world who think about experiential learning. Or a few weeks before that, we got together several hundred experts over the series of 6 dialogues to help 7 governments in Latin America think about different aspects of their COVID response. So in other words, they're great examples of using citizen engagement that are not representative, but that are targeted at specific kinds of expertise. And there are others that are using representative expertise. I think we need, in short, we need many more of these kinds of institutionalized uses of collective intelligence to help us solve problems in new ways. So I love them.
I know you do. Thank you, Beth. Given the hour, I'm afraid we are going to have to sign off at this point. Can I just thank you for your participation? We hope you've got something useful out of today's session and the series as a whole, and enjoy the other sessions in the series. But for now, thanks again to Beth. And Beth, please enjoy your Monday night. And thank you everyone else for your participation. And for the rest of us, have a terrific Tuesday. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Thanks all. Bye-bye.